1950, the census indicates that the non-white population in the city itself was 2 or 3%. 2 or 3%. By 10 years later, in 1960, there we had such a large influx of African American families that by 1960, the city had 12-13% African American population. Now that's a large jump, and society doesn't move that quickly.
Rochester was unprepared for the rapid expansion of the non-white population. So they finally committed themselves to some government housing, and so they built Hanover houses. They put something like over 3,000 people on less than 5 acres of land. So Hanover housing was just a low-cost housing that was incompatible with the real needs of the people.
Society hangs on to old practices. So the discriminatory practices that were in place, such as with Kodak, with Bauschelin, with the businesses hire more and more African Americans. Well, their mindset was still back in 1930, and they weren't willing to move that quickly.
My first real remembrance of racism was when I went to look for my first job when I was 17.
There was a lot of situations where you couldn't get jobs. If you were a contractor, you couldn't get a job unless you knew certain people. In other words, you had to know people to be able to get a job, or to be able to buy a house, or to be able to own anything at that time. And it was very difficult for women, especially, to own anything. You know, my mother had a very difficult time buying property because she was a Black woman.
But you got to live someplace. And so as we gained the income to buy in other neighborhoods, we were not allowed in Rochester to buy housing in the 19th Ward. We were threatened if we put in a bid for housing in the 19th Ward.
Well, when we bought that house on Lamberton Park, you know, we had to get a special permission to move into that community. And at that time, you couldn't live in the 19th Ward, which is, we own properties in the 19th Ward now, but back then you couldn't get into the 19th Ward. You know, not only Black people, but there were other people too that couldn't get in, you know, to that part of the community. That's what was called redlining.
3rd Ward and 7th Ward were the primary areas that Blacks could live in. You could not live in the other areas. There were restrictions. They had something called covenants. You know what that is?
Yes, a little bit about it.
Like if you bought the house, I'm giving you the house, but you can't sell it to, say, Blacks. You can't sell it to...
Yeah, they were restrictive covenants.
Yeah, restricted covenants. That's illegal now. So the main area where Blacks lived were here, 3rd Ward, 7th Ward, and you had a lot of churches, Black churches that supported the families and Black businesses.
When Joseph Avenue went through urban renewal, and the African American families, because our housing was quite restricted racially in Rochester, and so the African American families being relocated off of the Joseph Avenue neighborhood, they relocated to the Clarissa Street neighborhood.
Right.
There was no new housing, no expansion in the capacity to house families. So a one-family house all of a sudden turned into 4 mailboxes on the door. One family became a 4-family. So that's when you put too much pressure on building. The building's designed for, and if it was designed for one family, and you put 4 families, it's going to undo pressure on that structure, it's going to begin to fall apart, decay. So that brought congestion and social problems became more and more prevalent.
And then later on in, I think 1962, they built Chatham Gardens. And Chatham Gardens was to placate the housing needs of middle-class oriented blacks. Governor Rockefeller himself came to Rochester to unveil these Chatham Gardens. But he was picketed by a group of young, professionally trained blacks who formed an organization called the Nonpartisan Political League. The young, educated ones were very active in terms of political issues in the community.
And so when we went from 2% to 12%, the African-American population in society was not ready to give us equal access to employment opportunities and other, there's going to be an explosion.
Right.
So just think about what was going on up until the riot. Think, you got Martin Luther King march, you got Malcolm X, right? You got civil unrest. People, Rosa Parks is going on. And here in Rochester, they're boycotting. What are they boycotting? They're boycotting Kodak because Kodak won't do what? They won't hire any blacks, unless maybe you want to be a janitor.
And let me tell you, if you were black and wanted to work at Eastman Kodak, there were only about 2 or 3 jobs you could do. Either run an elevator, mop floors, or deliver stuff from one room, building to another. That's all.
Those at that time who wanted to work for Kodak couldn't do it. Most black people were not able to get good jobs at Kodak.
I think it was hard to get into certain employers, but I knew to get into Kodak, I needed a way to get in. I didn't push it, but one day she called me and she said, "Kathy, there's an opening, come interview for it." I went and interviewed for it and I got that job. 33 and a half years later is when I retired from Kodak. Shall we talk about how certain people, certain classes get better jobs within an employer? Sure, there was discrimination. Of course there was.
So when the population in the African American community got up to about 12%, you have the problem we don't want to hire you.
Right.
And what happened? Those numbers grew. What did we have? We had a riot. It burst the seams, forcing the change. The society could not contain that.
And then in the mid-60s, a lot of other cities started experiencing riots and everything because of jobs. But growing up, we didn't really we didn't have a problem until we had the riots in Rochester.
And I do remember the riots because I was home on furlough during that period of time. And I remember the riots starting on Joseph Avenue, and then it went over to Clarissa Street. And that's when the helicopter went down, and there was some fires and some other things that took place over there on Clarissa Street. But basically, the riot itself started over on either Clinton Avenue or Joseph Avenue.
But the riot started in the 7th Ward with a block party, and the police started carrying dogs then, and you started having incidences where the dogs would attack, and the people over there got upset on, say, a Friday night, and then it came over here.
Do you remember any of the riots that would happen throughout 1960s?
Do I remember? It started on my birthday, July 24th, 1964.
Oh.
Started on my birthday. So I went to stay with my mom and dad on Adams. And guess where the riot broke out that night? Right there on Clarissa Street. And I'm sitting in the window again, looking at all these people looting and robbing, and I'm like, what the heck? I couldn't be a part of that. But yeah, it started on my birthday. Never forget the date.
That was when we were teenagers too. We had the riots there. That was scary. One incident, and I don't know if you know about the riots, but one incident that happened is, and it happened right outside our window on the side of our house, is where that helicopter hit that house. Well, you don't know that when it hit. It sounded like a bomb, and everybody just panicked because they didn't know what it was.
They took a helicopter from the airport and came over trying to take pictures of the so-called riots. And there was an accident, or whatever you want to call it, but it crashed on Clarissa Street between Fremont and Edinburgh. That would be on the west side of the city. That was a big apartment house there.
One of my associates, Joan Coles, which you have met her, she told me about a couple of weeks ago, you know that helicopter that was up in the sky during the riots, it fell down on my house. And I didn't know that, the helicopter fell on her house. It scared me. I thought it was a bomb. I thought, my daughter was so scared that she thought it was the end of the world coming because people were fighting and everything. A lot of our stores, people stole different things, and I was just devastated about that.
But when those riots hit and they were throwing tear gas, I'm gonna tell you, we were scared, but our parents were deathly afraid because they knew danger. Sometimes when you're young, you don't understand as much of the danger. They knew the danger. My father, who never drove, he always took the bus. He was blind in one eye, but he never drove. Was coming home. He worked at a press company. He was an artist. Anyways, he was coming home, and they had a curfew. That curfew said, and I don't remember the exact time, you cannot be on the street. They put my dad in jail. My father was put in jail, put on one of them hard benches until the next morning they let him go. So you know what I mean when I say something like, they don't care. My father was innocently coming home that time of night. But that's what happens.
When we had the riots in Rochester, I was 13, 14 years old, okay? So I was up front and personal, Back then, let's say there were 4 or 5 brothers on the corner. Policeman would come around, look at you and say, get off this corner. And you better scatter, because if they came back around and you were there, they'd snatch you, throw you in the back of the car, or a paddy wagon, which young kids don't know nothing about in this day and age. A big truck would come by, throw you in the back of the truck, take you to a secluded spot, beat you behind and leave you, okay? You hear people say, well, why didn't you go to the police department and make a complaint? Go to where? For what? Ain't nobody was listening to you back then when you was black. And if you made it to the police department, they look at you and laugh and kick you down the stairs. Get out of my face. That's the lifestyle you were living back there in the 60s and 50s.
And of course, we're right back there because we're in Black Lives Matter. So the movement is back on, but okay.
There was a lot of police brutality. They had white policemen walking the beats in our neighborhoods, and they treated young black men like we were dirt. We began to just fear seeing police at that time. And I remember I got drafted in the Army. When I came back out, one of the things I did was went and looked at my yearbook, and 50% of the black young men that I went to school with were either dead or in prison. So that kind of stuff, which much of you see today, it was taking place at that time. I mean, racism played a real role. And with all the joy we had on Clarissa Street, we still had it hard because of the police brutality and racism.
Police brutality was real. I investigated 14 cases of police brutality. And one of the most grievous one was the Rufus Fairwell case. Rufus Fairwell had 2 jobs. He had a main job in an industry, and then at night, he worked at a gasoline station located on South Plymouth and Columbia Street. And he was closing up the gasoline station, and the police drove up and accused him of trying to break in. He said, I work here. And they didn't believe him. They beat him up and left him in a wheelchair. And there were other famous cases. I investigated 14 of them. And we knew, for example, there were 3 police on the force who constantly harassed and threatened blacks, but no penalties were ever exerted upon those 3 for their activities. So you had people who were intimately knowledgeable, not going by hearsay, but also going by investigation and compiling information.
Regular black people don't have any ability to curtail bad police acts. In fact, the reason I went to law school is because I saw black people getting beat up by cops when I was a kid. And that motivated me to become a lawyer.
Remember now, I came up at a time where there were no black county legislators, no black city council people, no black school board members, no black judges, okay? And I think I heard someone say you had interviewing Charles Price, who was the first black policeman.
So you said you were a police officer. So how was the police back then? Like, I knew it was like a lot of brutality and stuff going on.
Definitely, I will not deny that. I was the first black police officer in the city of Rochester, and you can understand.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
So you can understand that going in knowing nothing. When I got appointed, they gave me a club and a gun and said, "You're a policeman."
Did that how did that affect you? Yeah. Like,
Affect me? It was kind of both ways. I was doing a service, shall I say, for my community. Because like you children, your kids are coming up now, you're talking about police brutality and stuff like that. My big statement that I used to always tell the teenagers and all, and any person, don't stand on the outside and try to fight it. What good is you standing out there screaming and yelling, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that? Join them. Find out how they work and beat them from the inside out. In other words, if they do something wrong, you saw it, you knew about it. Now, if it come up again against you or somebody, wait a minute, you did that so-and-so, how come you're doing it, can't do it to this person over here this way? Why do you pick on this nationality and not that nationality?
So being a police officer, did you see anything, like witness anything wrong happening, like against the blacks and the whites?
Oh yes, definitely. Definitely. I was called everything but a child of God, and I was called the N-word by the white society, shall I say, here in Rochester. We had good segregation in Rochester. Don't think that Rochester was a nice, pure, nice city. It was not.
And so there's a tug of war going on. And so 99% of the police officers are European American. And they're going to protect their image and give priority to people who look like them. And so, yes, the African American becomes a stomping ground. They are going to discriminate and abuse their powers. And you get people being arrested when they really didn't commit a crime. And then society is not just police. They're just one aspect of a society is the police.
Did it affect anything that was happening on during the 60s and 70s? Did it affect you and your family? Like anybody around you?
No, I don't know if it affected my family that much because I never brought my work home with me. I left my work at the station when I came home. And I had 2 young daughters at the time, and I just told them what was going on, and they knew. But that was as far as it went.
So we saw the evolution of change brought on, forced upon the community by just a normal thing of people coming, larger numbers of certain ethnic groups coming into the neighborhood, and the police and employers, they were not equipped mentally to accommodate that reality.
And in the 1960s, all over the country, they had something they called urban renewal. They were tearing down buildings, and there was the promise they were going to build up something new and better. Only a lot of places it became, people used to call it urban removal because they tore down, but they never built up. So what you had was vacant lots where before you had, thriving communities.
You'll hear me say the term urban renewal, but sometimes you hear people say the term urban removal because they removed a lot of people from that area.
My class, my senior class at RIT was the beginning of the move to the Henrietta campus. Okay, and so I remember that whole transition, and there was a great move at that time of what they called urban renewal. That's where they changed the demographics of Rochester. That's when they built the expressway through the center of Rochester, that kind of thing. So all of that had an effect on the overall population in Rochester.
The highway was going to come through Clarissa Street. My mother worked on the committee of FIGHT organization, and she came back and told us we shouldn't sell because the highway is not going to come through Clarissa. It's going to go around Main Street. That was the biggest lie we ever heard. People were selling their homes and everything, and we should have fought a little longer, but we just didn't know, okay, about it. My mother was trying to tell people, but they didn't really listen. And it makes me angry to think about how they tricked our people out of their homes.
Do you remember urban renewal?
Yeah, I remember it because it tore up my neighborhood. Tore it up. Because the people that were in a position to take advantage of it politically, there was a group, if I'm not mistaken, called New Rochester Housing. And they took advantage of that 3% government money that was floating around. And they went around and were buying up the property. But what New Rochester Housing did, because they were entrepreneurs, they flipped those houses. They took that money and they remodeled. And that's what you see, what I call the new face of Cornhill. Like we were just uprooted. There was nowhere to find anyone that I grew up with.
Gentrification is what broke up the neighborhood. They started selling off the houses. They sold them cheap. Black people moved away, separated, divided. White people came in, the neighborhood was gone. So sadly, that takes away the sense of unity of the neighborhood. I mean, sure, we still had the churches and things, but when you move away from that area, you don't usually go to the same church. So now it's a whole new group of people that you're dealing with. So I have to, I don't know. Gentrification, I think, was the beginning of the end as far as that's concerned.
It separated us. It was like, like I was trying to give you an indication when we did the Clarissa Street reunion. The 10,000 people that came, that used to live in that neighborhood. That was the first opportunity it had since the 70s to come back home.
And the sad thing was Sheps and the Elks. Those are the last two businesses. They're around the corner, and you go in the parking lot, you see all the pictures people would bring back of how it was in the old neighborhood.
Look back at that time, know that it was a really great time for us as a people. Actually, I think it was a great time for everybody. And see if you maybe can't find a way to pull back some and bring back some of that awesome feeling of togetherness. We need to support each other. We need to be there for each other. We need to understand that we're all in this together. And I'm not just talking about Black people, everybody.
I look at Rochester now, and your generation has to pick up the baton, because in the early 60s, you did have aggressive young Black leadership in organizations like the Congress on Racial Equality, the NAACP. But the biggest challenge, I think, that your generation faces is the acquisition of knowledge, because the book shall set you free.
Education is a milestone, because what you get into your head in school, they can't take it out.
Use the best of what you got up there. Use the experiences you're getting as a community in teen empowerment. And wherever else you are having a welcome and respect for you as a human being.
I know that every one of you have more qualities than you even know you do. And I want you to recognize that. Don't let people fool you. You are the best. And we are looking forward to you guys leading us in the future. But I think I said it before, if you don't know what's going on in the world, how are you going to help yourselves in this world? Pay attention to what's going on, right?
I feel strongly that you cannot have a true identity unless you know the history of the people which you're a part of. I look at it in terms of like people without a historical memory are doomed to degradation. It's all in a book. We have a rich history of great people, but you have to know about them. You have to read them. And if my message to young people is to read as much about your history as you possibly can.
And we have a heritage, we have a history, we have an obligation, and we need to tell our story